Welcome to the Getting Divorced Without Losing Your Mind podcast. This is Corey Shapiro. We are going off script today. We have a special treat, a guest, and I want to welcome Michael Lennington to the show. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Great to be here, Corey.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You know, I like to think deeply about divorce, but I don't know everything. And I had to reach out to someone who is an expert on business execution, wrote one of my favorite books, who changed my mind. And if you know me personally, to change my mind is hard to do. And if you want to learn how to really excel, the first book you have to read of his is 12-Week Year, which is amazing. And there's a chapter in that book about accountability. And his new book, which we're going to discuss in detail today, is about accountability. It's about the idea that how to move from like the victim mindset to the accountability mindset. And he goes all in depth. And we're going to talk about that concept today. But my question for you is, of all the things that you could have focused on, Michael, if you were going to write a second book after your great 12-week year, why did you focus on accountability?
That's a great question. And the reason that we decided to focus on accountability is both Brian and I believe that accountability is a mindset that the more accountable you are, the better your results in life, the better your outcomes in life. Accountability gives you control. And I think it's a real powerful way of looking at the world. And so because it is so foundational to getting things done, it has to be part of an execution system like the 12-week year, because if you don't take accountability, you're not going to get much out of the system.
And you might be wondering, how can I relate this to my divorce? Because most of my listeners are in their divorce and difficult divorces. And I'll tell you why I think this is important. Because first of all, Michael makes things simple in the book. It's going to really change your mindset. Secondly, if you're in this victim mindset, and we're going to go over it, I'm going to ask Michael to really explain it. It's going to help you move through your divorce, I think, in a better way. And I really want you to understand this, because when I read it, I've never read a better definition, explanation of how to, first of all, of the victim mindset, and then how to move out of it. So, Michael, let's just start with the basics. Tell me, what is the victim mindset?
Well, the victim mindset is really looking at your life and blaming external events or people for, or in some cases, even internal things like I'm not feeling well, or I have a handicap or whatever. That mindset of blaming things that are outside of my control, either external to me or that I don't control, for my problems. And while that may be partially true, there may be people who have done things that they shouldn't have done to me. I could have been victimized for sure by other people. So we're not saying that people don't get victimized by other people, but the victim mindset sort of sets up camp in that place. It blames external events. It blames other people. It blames certain circumstances in my life that I don't control for my results and for my experiences in life. And so when we give away that power, when we look at the external world and things that I don't control is creating my life, then I'm powerless. I cannot change because all those things are outside of my control. And so if I look at the reasons for where I'm at as being outside of my control, I'm hopeless. Right? What can I do? So the victim mindset really gives away your power because it looks at the problem as external to you rather than potentially internal to you. And so there's generally a mix of things, internal mindset and perspectives and external events that kind of combine to create my current life. But I don't control the other stuff. I just control the stuff that's in my brain and my thinking. And so, that's what we call the victim mindset. They tend to stay stuck in their victimhood.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about why it's so easy to fall into this victim mindset.
Well, it's easy because the payoffs of having a victim mindset are immediate, right? If I'm blaming external things or things I don't control for my circumstances, then I'm free to not change. I'm free not to do the work. I'm free not to have to do the sometimes difficult introspection of what my choices that I've made have created in my life. And so because I don't have to change, it's easy. If I don't look at the world that way, when I have an accountable mindset, there's work involved. And so a lot of people don't like work. So the short-term benefit of a victim mindset is immediate comfort, right? Immediate, innocence. And I don't have to be responsible for change. And so it's sort of the low energy state. Saying a victim is low energy in the moment. In the long run, it's really a very big energy drain. But in the short term, it's an easy place to go.
I see. Okay. Now, bringing this into the divorce world, which I know is not your expertise, but, when I think of people who are stuck in these difficult divorces, I would consider they're in low energy. I think of that. Not to say there's a lot going on, but they are sort of stuck. But the problem I see doing this for a while is it's challenging for people to recognize that they're in that low energy victim mindset state. So what things would you think? And remember, these people might be in crisis, Michael. So, so they're stressed. Then they could be very smart people, but when people are emotionally stressed, they're compromised. So how can you help these people who are in crisis, emotionally stressed, try to get out of this, which just seems to be really hard to do if you're in it?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is sometimes we get blindsided by something, and the natural response to say somebody giving me a divorce request or whatever can create this kind of immediate, emotional turmoil. It can make me feel bad. I feel unhappy, and I feel betrayed. Perhaps I feel victimized, and in reality, that might be happening. Right? That actually somebody might have done you wrong. And so there's this period of time where it's almost natural and unavoidable, right, to not feel that way, and that's fine. I mean, that's a lot of times when we encounter that kind of stuff, we can kind of get quiet and not be high energy. But the problem doesn't arise with that immediate response. The problem arises when I decide to set up camp in that mindset. Because if I start to blame others and I start to really want to, make their lives miserable and do things that are going to hurt them, the only person I'm really ultimately hurting is myself, because I'm stuck in that moment. And I don't control other people. I don't control the person who's suing for divorce or whatever. I just control me. And so the important thing, I think, when you experience all that turmoil and that stress, it's natural, right? Don't try to pretend it doesn't exist, but just as soon as you possibly can, begin to think about the things that are still under your control. What are the options of choice and action that you have right now that you can start to take advantage of? And while it doesn't make the pain go away, it starts that journey. And it doesn't make the feeling of being victimized go away, but it starts to create this sense of you do still have power, you do still have free will choice, and you can still make decisions that are going to make your life better. And so, it all sounds theoretical, but in reality, it is powerful to realize you have degrees of freedom in any circumstance, and that you can take advantage of those degrees of freedom, and you don't have to stay stuck. And that's both uplifting and powerful in my view.
What I'm thinking about what you're saying is a lot of people who come to me initially, they focus so much on the impact of the other side's strategy on them. Okay, so whatever the other side's doing to make things difficult, that's the prism or the framework they're looking things through. But I always say to them, what you're trying to say is, what's in our control? We have a control to create our own frame, our own strategy. And why don't we focus on that? We can't take away that they're trying to make us look like the worst people in the world, but why can't we do something similar to make it, at least a fair fight?
Right.
So I think that's really helpful. Am I getting on the right path of what people should be thinking about?
Yeah, in every circumstance, right? We have options of choice, and we might not like our choices. I don't want to pay taxes, and I also don't want to go to jail. So, but I'm going to pay my taxes because I don't want to go to jail more than I don't want to pay my taxes. And so, while I'm not in a situation where my choices are necessarily pleasant, there's always better choices than others, and that's the path to really kind of getting out of whatever situation you're in, whether it's divorce or anything else, faster and with more control over the outcomes.
Right. Okay, so that's the victim mindset. That's in chapter 2 of the book, and it's like Uncommon Accountability. It's a great book. That chapter alone is fantastic. But then we move on to chapter 3, and that's when you get into the accountability mindset. So first, can you contrast the victim mindset with the accountability mindset?
The easiest way for me to do that is to say, and I've kind of already kind of tipped my hand a bit here with the victim mindset, but the victim mindset looks at things outside of its control as being the source of its problems. So, if somebody let me down, I got fired by a boss who didn't like me. I don't have the advantages everybody else had, and those are all things that may be true, but they don't necessarily allow me to change. And so, the victim mindset is very much about staying stuck in this place you are, because all of the things you're thinking about are blame, and it feels somewhat good to blame somebody else. But the problem is that they don't even know you're doing it, probably. they're probably not even going to be affected by it. The only person affected by your blame, getting stuck in blame, is you, because you're going to stay stuck. So the accountable mindset is not so much that it feels good to get blindsided or to have something negative happen, because those things happen to all of us. But that accountable mindset bobs back up to the surface quicker, and it looks for the degrees of freedom you have to make better choices. And so victim mindsets tend to be focused on the past, an event, or someone else who done me wrong. Accountability mindset is, okay, this is the situation. What do I have to do now to optimize results going forward? And so the victim mindset is realizing that you always have control. You might not like the situation you're in, but you always have control to make better choices, the right choices to move you in the right direction. So that mindset of ownership of your situation, taking ownership, allows you to take ownership of the positive choices that you can make to create a different life. And this sounds really theoretical, but it's not really. It's just how we tend to either get stuck in our victim mindset, or how we can quickly shift to that ownership mindset, that accountable mindset that lets us identify, what we can do, the things we can do to make things better.
No, that's really interesting, because, you talked about the past, and let's take like a custody case. In a contested custody case in court, basically the whole trial is going to be about the past, right? But, and just trying to beat up everyone, because trying to show that the other parent's not as good as you are. But if you're outside that court system, and I'm not saying both people have to agree to do this, but just think about the higher level, is you're thinking about the future. How can we set up a parenting plan, a co-parenting plan that will work for everyone? So it almost sounds like, to me, like a different energy level, the accountability mindset, where like the first one is like, okay, let's look at the past. Let's look at how, we really don't have any control. But the next one is, okay, this is what we have. Let's accept it. But how can we make this better? And I think a lot of people who come to me, Michael, in divorce don't realize the limitation of the court system. And, and when I read that, I was like, this to me is like almost like this. I could change your title to how to, persuade you not to go to court and maybe do something outside of court to be more collaborative, to come up with more choices, because that's not how the game really works. All right. So I have a quote here for you, which I'm going to read from your book. It goes, while a victim mindset can trap us in the mire of disappointment, regrets, and resentment, an accountable one can set us free to achieve our biggest aspirations and live a life of meaning and fulfillment. When I read that, that was it. I was like, that's the path I want people to do, to move out of a difficult divorce into a better post-divorce life. So if you could break that down to me, am I on the right path here, using what you know about, business execution and to try to make a divorce better?
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things when you're in court, listening to your lawyer is probably the number one thing you want to do. Because if you stand up and say the truth around accountability, not that you should ever lie in court, but that you're partially responsible and taking all that ownership, that could be better decided upon with the counsel of your lawyer, because court is not about taking this big personal growth process forward. It's about optimizing your situation. And so court's kind of this weird crucible where you've got to go to hold what I'm going to say lightly. But outside of court, I think that mindset of you mentioned this thing with children, right? What's your goal? Is your goal to hurt your spouse, or is your goal to optimize the children's experience through the process, which is going to be painful for them? And even if your spouse doesn't participate, you still control what you control. You still make things okay for the kids when they're with you. You still, show up in a way that they know you put them ahead of the divorce. There's a mindset around accountability that you're making choices to optimize the future, right? So, and that's your kids. The victim mindset wants to create penalties for the past and continue the fight. So I think that's where the accountability mindset is a really fast way to heal after divorce. Also to make the least negative impact on those that are affected by, like, children, and your spouse, really, your ex-spouse as well.
I love that. Penalties of the past. I love that. So true, Michael. So give me 3 common shifts. If people are like, okay, maybe I'm in the victim mindset, I hear what you're saying, I'm listening to it, what can I do to start? If I was going to run a marathon, that's a lot. That's overwhelming. So we start small. So how can I start small? Give me just 3 shifts people can make to move out of that victim mindset into the accountability mindset.
I think the first thing is to kind of determine what your freedom is, what the freedom of choice you have in the moment, right? So what are the things that I could do to create a better outcome? So let's say I want to run that race. What are the things available to me? I want to run the marathon, or I want to improve a relationship. What are the actions that I can take, right? It's not what other people are going to do. It's what are the actions I'm going to take. And being really clear on what those things are. What do you control? You control the way you think and the way you act. That's about all you got, right? You don't control outcomes. You just control the way you think and the way you act. So what's the most productive way of thinking about the opportunity ahead of you? And then what are the most productive actions to take to accomplish that goal you want to accomplish? And so now we're getting into why accountability is the foundation of execution, right? It's understanding, first of all, what are the beliefs and the thoughts that are going to drive me towards my goal? And then how do I act in those consistently so that I accomplish what my goal is? And so that's true of improving a relationship post-divorce even, but it's also, running a marathon, everything else is what are the core activities, and then take ownership of doing those things, taking those activities. And there may be barriers in the way that you don't control, but as long as you work on the things that you do control, you give yourself your best shot at accomplishing your biggest goals. And I know that sounds like a bromide, but the problem with accountability in society is that when we hear about people being held accountable, we never think that it's a positive thing, right? Because we always think accountability is something that's imposed on us by somebody else. And it generally is imposed when we've done something that either we didn't, do what we needed to do at work, or we did something wrong, and something, now some external power with more authority than we have punishes us for our bad mistake as if it was intentional, right? And so that negative approach to accountability is really unhealthy. When you realize that accountability is not about somebody else blaming you and applying consequences. Accountability is yours and yours alone. No one else can hold you accountable. So nobody has the power to hold you accountable. You always have choice, and accountability is about making those choices that line up with what you want.
I think it does. I think that's a good first step. And you're sort of, again, a great illustration of a simple concept in communication. You can't control how the other side's going to text you. You can't control how the other side's going to email you and how aggressive or inappropriate they're going to be, right? You can't control that. But I always tell people we can control our response. Mm-hmm. And that's like the start of being accountable. And I always tell people these texts and these emails are going to become exhibits if it goes that far. So there is no upside. There is no upside to have that little fun fight, because the judge is going to think it's inappropriate, and it's probably going to paint you in a bad light in a year from now when the judge actually looks at it, when there's no emotion. So it just seems to be the smart choice. One, if you're going to protect your children, and two, trying to get your positions in court met, because the judges only can probably give you the positions that you want if the judge thinks you're halfway reasonable. If they think you're unreasonable and difficult, then there'll probably be a little bit more of a challenge. And speaking of challenge, when I was reading this and thinking about our conversation, I thought about if any personality traits, is there any personality traits, and what's that interplay with the mindset choices you have?
So if you're asking me what the mindset traits are of a victim, it's powerlessness, it's lack of responsibility, it's desire for comfort, and those are all powerful things that kind of anchor us to where we are. If we want to change, the thinking that got us to where we are isn't going to be the thinking that's going to get us out of where we are. So it's that lockdown mentality of the victim mindset that continues to blame others. And one of the things, there's benefits to being a victim, right? You don't have to change. People often give you sympathy in the beginning anyway. And so there's that good sympathy. Maybe you get a beer bought for you at the bar if you tell your story just right. But the reality is that stuff wears off. Those short-term outcomes wear off, and the victim mentality has some really deep, long-term prices, right? No growth, no change, falling short of your goals, not being healthy. There's a lot of outcomes of having that victim mindset that really are devastating. And it's important to understand that you can shift that mindset. So locking in on those elements of being right. Just because somebody else is lying about you, for example, in a divorce, you still know you're right. You still know the truth. convincing the other party that you're right is not your game. It doesn't matter. What other people think of you is none of your business, ultimately, right? Because it's not, you can't change it. You can't improve it. All you can do is just be you, and they can make their own decisions about how they feel about you. So being right, winning that who's right, who's wrong war is a lose, it's a zero sum game. But that's kind of another example. People want to look at the causes of their problems as being outside of them, because then they don't have to change, and they don't have to, really face the truth, which is I've chosen to be exactly where I am. Now, I'm not saying that bad things don't happen. I've said that before. It's just how we respond to those things that kind of create the long-term carnage.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. That's really good stuff. And it brings me to my next point I want to address with you. And you do come up with these simple concepts that really do change things quickly. And I thought one thing you came up with in your book was these zones. You came up with this wonderful graph, and it was the comfort zone, the growth zone, and the panic zone. Can you explain that concept? And when I was reading it, I get a lot of people who are stuck in bad marriages, even before the divorce process, and they come from me for like a consult, but they're so scared and they can't move forward. And I thought this could really help people understand what's really going on internally. So can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, I forget the guy's name now. Shoot. But he was I believe he's an English statistician, and he said that all models are wrong, some are useful. And so this model, is wrong, but it's also useful, I think, in terms of looking at how this works. But, the comfort zone is the zone where we are comfortable. We're not stretching into the areas we're uncertain about. We're just comfortable, right? And I'm comfortable at my current skill set. I can do it without thinking. And the problem with that comfort zone is because I'm not pushing the boundaries of what I'm doing, I'm not learning, I'm not growing. So I'm comfortable, but I'm not growing. The next zone outside of that, so kind of consider that inside of the circle. The next circle outside of that, the larger boundary circle, is the area of growth. It's the growth zone. And that's where we're stepping into uncertainty. We're not sure necessarily how we need to behave, what the right mindset is. And so we're experimenting. We're stepping up. And as adults, that's how we grow, right? We try stuff. It either works or it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, we figure out how to make it work. And we just kind of go through that process. And that's the growth zone. It's where we get better and we step into the uncertainty of the unknown, but we learn, right? And we figure it out. But there's a point at which that growth zone turns into what I call the panic zone. And the panic zone is where, it's like stepping off a cliff, right? I don't know what's happening next. I'm out of control. This is something I'm not competent to handle. And if you go there, obviously you're going to go right back to the comfort zone as quickly as you possibly can. Yeah. So there's that. And so when I think of that magic spaces is to always stay in that growth zone where it's uncomfortable, because growth is going to be uncomfortable, but it's not so great that you're going to panic and fail because it's just too much, right? And so for some people, that growth zone isn't too far away from where they are now. For some folks, it's I can go a long way before I hit the panic zone. But ultimately, all of us kind of go through those things, in my view. And what accountability is the willingness to stay uncomfortable. It's the willingness to own my own growth and to step into that growth zone and challenge myself to get better. And that can be in relationships too. I'm comfortable with the current relationship with my wife. It's not great, but I know how to do it. And, it's kind of tit for tat. If she's mean to me, I'm going to be mean to her in equal measure. And so it's just kind of this, I'm making sure that the ledger's balanced. But I think when you want to improve a relationship, you've got to step out and take actions that represent that relationship you want to have in the future, even if they're not reciprocated, because you don't control anybody else. You just control you. And if you're waiting for other people to change, you're going to wait a long, long time. But if you change, and you can decide to change right now, you got power to change relationships in the moment, and they may not come along, right? They may not, but you've done everything you could do to make that relationship better. And that's what I mean by the growth zone. And I think that's where all of us know that. But because it's uncomfortable, we tend not to venture out in that area too often. Plus, I get to be right in the comfort zone. I'm right. They're wrong. Sometimes the real growth happens when you realize you're not right, right? Because if I like to ask people, is the belief that your beliefs are true, right? We all believe that our beliefs are true. Otherwise, it wouldn't be beliefs by definition. The problem is some of our beliefs are true and some of them aren't, but we behave based upon our beliefs. And so, if your belief is that your partner's a really bad person, you're never going to go out into that growth zone in terms of that relationship. So, you don't know if that belief is true until you actually begin to behave differently and see what the result is. So that's my bit there.
Oh, that's good stuff. In the divorce world, I see it where, well, as I said, you're first stuck in this bad marriage, you can't move on. But also when you finally get in a divorce, and if you have a difficult divorce, it could be a slog. And what happens is generally the comfort zone is going to be doing nothing, because you got to, really roll up your sleeves and be very detailed to prove a case in court. You got to show, people say like, they have so much money. That's not what the judge wants to see. The judge wants evidence, that they can look at and not thinking so hard. It has to be simple for the court. And to get all that together, you have to grow. But what a lot of times what happens is people don't do the proper work in discovery, that process of getting all the information. And then the court's like, well, you guys have been wasting 2 or 3 years. Now we got to do a trial, and everyone's in the panic zone because people didn't do what they were supposed to do. So it seems like it's like almost like you're in the comfort zone. I'm okay, everything's okay. And then you're like, I'm in the panic zone. So to get that happy medium is probably it's not as easy as it sounds. Is that right?
No, it's not as easy as it sounds. And we're wired for comfort, right? But the outcomes of not taking those actions you were describing can be pretty disastrous. So it's being more worried about what's going to happen than what's happening right now, so that you can take action to keep those bad things from that panic zone from happening. I mean,
seriously.
And the funny thing is that I would say that truth is the only safe ground to stand on. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that more than 100 years ago, but she says truth is the only safe ground to stand on, and I think that's a true statement. And so some of your beliefs that are around change are probably flawed, and the only way to figure them out is to step out of that space. But in the court of law, listen to your lawyer. Because you might own the truth, but if the person your opponent doesn't, the truth might get you in trouble. And I don't mean that. Don't lie in court, but just listen to your lawyer. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, interesting. Okay, that's very good. So let's move on to this consequences to change. And you had a quote here in chapter 6, and I'll read it. It goes, "When children are young, they don't possess the cognitive ability to reason and understand like adults do. So consequences are the primary method used to shape behavior. That may work for little kids, but it doesn't optimize the performance of adults. So why is it that sometimes we only change when we have all these consequences?"
It's a really good question. And as children, I think children understand consequences as well, but they have a strong desire for what they want right now. And so telling them and helping them to make better longer-term decisions rather than short-term decisions is really helpful. And so with children, I think the best way to do that is to talk to them about the consequences of their choices. So if you do that, what's going to be the consequence? If you do that, what's going to be the consequence? So if you decide not to wash the dishes, what's going to be the consequence? Okay, this is going to happen. If I decide to wash the dishes, what's going to be the consequence? Which of those two consequences do you want? Right? Because it's not about the consequences of being applied by the parent. It's about the consequences being chosen by the child. So that's part one. But part two on that is as you were saying, and I've actually say the question again, because I got down that pathway about children. Because I'm not saying spank kids just to shape behavior. They need to have their head in the game to understand why a consequence.
Yeah, well, but why is it that it's so hard for us to change sometimes, unless there's just consequences?
The thing about consequences when applied by someone else, right? So in our book, I went up and I looked on online Webster Dictionary when we were writing the book, and I looked at the definition of accountability. And every one of the examples that they used in that definition were negative, right? It was about somebody who did something that wasn't, enough, didn't do it up to snuff, or they did something wrong. And then in every case, accountability was about dropping the ball, making a mistake, having a failure. And then on the other side of that is that in many cases, it was also about somebody with authority and power coming in to punish the person that did whatever they did or didn't do whatever they did, as if it was intentional, right? Like they intended to not be successful. They intended. And so that punishment comes in, and that's a consequence model that a lot of leaders use with their employees. But that's a parent-child model. That's not an adult-to-adult model, because in the adult-to-adult model, the fact of the matter is that consequences are mine in the situation, but I'm free to either choose to do this stuff or not to do this stuff. And when a leader applies consequences, it implies a couple of things. It implies that he knows better than I do about what actions I should take, or she knows better than I do about what actions I should take. And when that model comes in, if I don't behave in the way that they know is best for me, I either get a slap on the wrist or some other penalty, or if I do what they think is the action that's best for me, I get a carrot, right? So it's kind of this carrot and the stick mentality. It's like how you encourage a horse or a mule to pull a wagon. And that's not what works with people, because people have free will choice and they can either do the stuff they want to do or not do that stuff. And if you apply consequences to an adult, it's going to create resentment. It's going to create pushback. It's maybe even create sabotage, but they're certainly going to check out of any option of owning it. What we want to do is replace that kind of consequence model of leadership with this accountable model. And it's similar to what we talk about with the child, is you confront people with their choices, right? If you get this stuff done, here's what's going to happen, right? You're going to get promoted. You're going to get a raise. You're going to have a long-term career here. If you're not willing to do the things that we're paying you for, the consequence of that choice is that we can't keep you here. Not that you're a bad person. You're just not a good fit. So your choice about which action you want to take is completely up to you, because you're also taking the choice of the consequences of those actions. And so if I take ownership, I realize, you know what? If I want to be successful here, I'm either going to do this stuff or not. But I realize it's my power, it's my control, it's my choice. You're not trying to force me to do something I don't want to do. I'm making a choice to do this stuff that I'm doing because it creates some kind of outcome I'm after. And I know that sounds really subtle, but when a leader comes in and tries to manage with consequences, he gets people up to some minimum standard of where the negative consequences stops, or she gets them up to that minimum point. But they won't give you discretionary effort. And so as soon as the negative consequences stop, performance drops down to where it was before. There's no learning. There's no growth. There's just a response to external stimuli. And so when we talk about accountability, it's I take ownership. I'm not going to stop at the minimum. I'm going to stop at the point at which, I feel like I'm doing what I need to do to get what I want to get out of life. And it's typically way beyond the minimum standard. Anyway. So that's what the difference is in terms of consequences, because what I want to do not is apply consequences as a leader. I want to confront people with the choices they're making, and then the consequences of the choices they're making, because they're the ones deciding what the consequences are, not me. Does that make sense?
I think that's a good point, Michael. Really good point. And, for people who are listening who are in a divorce, and they should ask their lawyer, what are the consequences on my behavior? Because I see a lot of time people come in, they say what they want. Probably what happens when people get hired on jobs, they say I want to be this, I want to do that. And then you see the reality set in. And then if later on, if your attorney's like, hey, what are you doing? They say, well, maybe you changed your position. Maybe you changed your behavior. Maybe you thought it was too tough. If I was training for a marathon, hey, this is a little harder than I thought. And that's okay. But then you should just hear, what's the consequences? Well, the consequences of that, if we were talking about a marathon, is you're probably not going to finish it. It's going to be really hard, or it's going to be 12 hours. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's helpful, because I think me as a professional, sometimes I want, that people to do everything they can to do their stated goal. And I think what you're saying is, hey, you're in the driver's seat. This is the consequences of your current behavior that can change or not change. And, it's important. So we're not going to be in that panic zone, come in a year or two when we have to actually do some real work in this case for a deposition or a trial. You got to really work now. And just like in a marathon or working for someone else, there's things you have to do on a daily basis to make sure you excel. All right. One topic that really spoke to me, and it's not about climate change, but the way you say it, it could be about climate change. It's impact erosion. And I thought this was really interesting because you're just thinking on these things I never really thought about. But can you explain that concept? Because the timing, I think it was the timing of is it the benefit and then of the consequences, and that's what messes all of us up. So talk a little bit about that concept.
Yeah. So with consequences, to shape behavior. So again, this isn't a leadership model, but if I'm applying consequences to manage the behavior of my team, and that's a very common approach to leadership and management. Holding people accountable is one of the holy grails of leadership, right? I got to hold my people accountable. The problem with that is that hold people accountable is really, I want to apply negative and positive consequences. And so the problem with that is that consequences are a very blunt and imprecise instrument for changing behavior. And so when we start to apply negative consequences, and maybe it's a reprimand or something like that, That'll work in the short term, but people kind of get inured to that. They get used to it. And so you got to ramp up the volume of sometimes of the consequences over time so that people respond to them. And so it ends up really creating this super negative, relationship. And the other part of it is the positive consequences, even when you apply them. They may not be exactly what the person wants. Some people like things different, right? So I like this, I like that, and you have one model fits all. So so sad if it doesn't make you happy. This is the consequence. And so that they're blunt and they do erode because people get used to them. They become entitled to them. And then if things don't work out of their control, they're still entitled to that outcome, right? So, in other words, if I do what you say to do and I do it right and it gets done, but the business doesn't make a profit and I don't get a raise, I'm kind of blaming you for that. I did my job and I'm not getting the consequence I wanted. So, and I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but there is a need over time to ramp up the consequences, and it creates a really bad situation. So consequences are not a great long-term way to manage people, in my view.
Yeah, I guess I see that in your last point where people who say to me, "Hey, I'm doing everything right. I'm writing these nice, I'm being polite. I'm following the rules. I'm paying everything on time, and I'm still the villain."
Yeah.
And sometimes, as you know, sometimes the payoff is longer in the future than you think. So listen, I know you're a busy gentleman, and I really appreciate you coming on this podcast, giving us a different way of thinking about our divorce, using these concepts about the victim mindset, the accountability mindset, and this little, framework of how to move out of some zones. So if you were just, let's say, having, coffee, knowing what you know about execution, knowing what you know about victim mindset, knowing what you know about accountability mindset, and someone's really struggling in their divorce and they're stuck in that victim mindset in a gentle way, because as you said, you have to paint pictures and sometimes it's hard for us to listen. What words would you say to that person just to get them, maybe moving that one or two steps so they won't feel so stuck? And so
that's a great question. First thing I would do is probably just acknowledge the situation, right? Validate how they're feeling and just have an honest, friendly conversation with my buddy or whatever. And then I'd say, it sounds terrible. So what are your choices? Right. And then I just ask them about I'd use questions. So what are your options? What are some other ways you could do that? What's your biggest fear in this? How are you going to manage that? What's happening to the kids? So I'd be asking them questions and I'd be asking them what they could do to sort of optimize their situation, given where they are, right? I mean, the optimum would not be where you are, but given where you are right now, given the reality, what degrees of freedom do you have to change it? And then are you willing to take those actions? I mean, are you really that uncomfortable that you're willing to change to create a different circumstance for yourself? That's technically what I would say. But I mean, I'm going to ask them about how they're doing, and I'm not going to make them wrong. I'm going to kind of join them where they are and just ask them questions, not tell them answers, because you know what, my answers wouldn't be the right ones anyway. But they'll know. Most people know when you really ask them the questions. Most people know what they need to do. They might not want to admit it, but they know.
Yeah, no, I like that, Michael. And that shows you're a real true professional, because when you ask questions, you're not coming from your own bias, your own story, your own history. You're really trying to just give them an opportunity just to think things out loud. And I think that's great. So I appreciate, again, to give us some clarity. This is Michael Lennington. His book is Uncommon Accountability, and you can go to his website on the book, uncommonaccountability.com. It's also available on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. Is that right, Michael?
That is absolutely true.